and good afternoon. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all, anywhere you are connected. Thank you very much for joining us at this event. My name is Teresa Santana, and on behalf of the SEG Women's Network Committee, I would like to welcome Andrea Crook, that is our presenter today. I will give a brief introduction of Andrea to you. So Andrea is the co-founder and CEO of EcoSeis Solutions Limited, where she leads a team focused on innovation and operational excellence and has helped develop EcoSeis. EcoSeis is a method for achieving a 50% land footprint reduction while safely acquiring high-quality subsurface data. So at EcoSeis, Andrea oversees the advancement in geophysical research, seismic acquisition design, operations, processing QC, and interpretation services, and also software development. Andrea graduated from the University of Manitoba with a bachelor's honors in geophysics, and she continues to engage academically by acting as an instructor, for example, on the Society of Exploration Geophysicists, and also contributing to the field of geophysicists with numerous award-winning papers and presentations. Andrea is the recipient of the 2019 Canadian Society of Exploration Geophysicists Technical Achievement Award and is the Society 2023 Symposium honoree, and she's also the board of director for the Clean Resource Innovation Network. So with that, welcome Andrea. And as a reminder for you all, you can always put your question in the QA section. So at the end of the presentation, Andrea can address them all. So with no further, I would like Andrea to start with her talk.
Thank you very much, Teresa, and thank you for the opportunity to present. So today I'm going to be talking about decarbonizing subsurface imaging, but more specifically, it's going to be the land footprint and environmental reduction of seismic. Some of you may have seen this presentation before. We were invited to give this back in February. It was initially presented in Barranquilla at the conference there. We've since expanded them, the presentation. I'm going to go through a bit about the impact of high-density seismic, potential solutions, and then the EcoSeis project, going through the alternative geometries results and some of the work we've done in phase 2. So to start off, the data set that I'm going to show you is a shallow data set. All the technology I'm showing to you also applies equally to deep data sets. We just need to scale that. So this is one of the challenges of imaging for near surface. Here we are focused in on a far target, and here we're focused in on the near target. So we need to make a choice when we're focusing with our seismic acquisition as well. When we're looking at deep targets, we typically have our lines further apart, and when we're in shallow targets, we typically have them closer together. And if we want really high resolution data from surface to any target depth, we need to look at the line widths. So one of the problems with going to higher density seismic is often that we put the lines much closer together. This was first recognized in Canada by the Canadian Oil Sands Innovation Alliance. They began a challenge back in 2017, culminating in 2021 with the COSIA Foresight Alberta Innovates Reducing Seismic Exploration Footprint. But there are other oil and gas technology challenges that have looked at clean tech to reduce the emissions associated with all aspects of industry. We're also on a journey to net zero as a world. This is a big focus here in Canada on net zero by 2050. So anything we can do to make our operations more efficient and reduce the emissions associated with acquiring data we should strive to accomplish. Now, before we jump into the different types of surface methods, I wanted to show you an example here of two different geometries. On the left, we're looking at a low trace density data set, and on the right, we've increased the trace density by 16 times. And you can see that we have much better resolution along all the horizons, better continuity, better imaging of subtle faults. So this is one of the reasons we want to go to high density data. But now I'm going to show you a short video of some high density seismic up here in Canada's northern boreal forest. This is ultra high density, where the line is only 30 meters apart. And the lines are typically cut, if you look at these north-south lines, they're much easier to see than the east-west. Those are cut about 2.75 meters to 3 meters wide, and then the lines running east-west are cut 1.75 meters wide. So we'd have source lines on the lines that are going in the north-south direction. We can also see some well pads and some roads through here. So this has a very high density or high impact on surface seismic and the environment. At times, anywhere from 5 to 25% of the forest may be cut to acquire these seismic programs. Some of the potential solutions that have been put forward are to miniaturize equipment so that we can cut the lines narrower. And on the top, you can see an example where we have the regular cut seismic lines. And on the bottom, there is a seismic program here as well. You can faintly see some tracks in the snow on the image, but an avoidance cutting and narrower lines has been used to reduce the impact. But even if we cut the lines narrower, we still have that interconnected pathways of lines. And that's where another potential solution is to look at alternative geometries that have fewer interconnected pathways and have fewer linear kilometers of cut lines overall. However, when we start looking at geometries like this, then we need to incorporate some more advances in processing, because as you can see in the top image here, we may end up with gaps in the data that we then need to interpolate in processing to recreate the data. Now, I'm going to pause for a moment, because what about areas where there are no trees? Why would we need to change our approach? In areas where there are no trees, we still may be having a negative impact on the environment. Think about acquiring in a sensitive desert habitat where there may be protected species, or we've seen some examples elsewhere in the world where lines have to be cleared anyway, even if there are no trees, to make the ground more even to drive the equipment in. And those can leave permanent scars. So the less we do of that, the better. Another consideration is that when we have fewer linear kilometers to travel, we're going to be burning less fuel and generating fewer emissions. So the goal of the EcoSeis project was, number one, to reduce the land footprint and GHG emissions. But whatever reduction we apply, we need to make sure that it doesn't impact the subsurface data quality. So a critical component of the project was to ensure that we're maintaining subsurface resolution. The other consideration is whatever we do in the field, it must be done safely and efficiently for all the people operating there. And if we can reduce costs, then we may have a solution that people will actually adopt. And I'm happy to say that we have achieved all 4 of these goals, and I'm going to walk you through how we did that. The project strategy was full validation. It's very easy to acquire seismic acquisition tests in the field, maybe put out a few different sensors while you're acquiring your regular 3D. But it takes time and effort to take all those data sets through full processing, interpretation, and quantitative analyses such as inversion. So starting off with why miniaturize sources? Here in Canada, as I mentioned, we're typically cutting our source lines 2.75, maybe up to 4 meters wide, and receivers about 1.75 meters wide. In this geometry example, that with those line widths, we would be cutting about 8% of the total number of trees in the seismic survey area. If all we did was reduce the source line interval to be the same width as the receiver line interval. On this program, that would be a 25% reduction in total area of cutting. Now, the exact value is going to vary depending on your geometry. This is symmetrically sampled with equal source and receiver line intervals. There is going to be some variation. Now, if we make the line narrower, then we need equipment that fits down those narrower lines. And there is concern that when we're dealing with a large charge versus a small charge, the small charge may be lacking in frequency content and signal strength. The good news is that on some of the testing that we've done, we did find that there are some areas where small charges can perform well. And although we may not have the exact same amplitude, we are still getting good broadband signal. And in some areas, we actually saw improvement in signal. So the tests that were run were done at 2 locations. Initially, and I'm going to show you some results from that. We've since repeated these tests on a 3D and another 2D. And the test here was with a clear wave explosive charge. This is a miniaturized directional source from Orica, and then the conventional explosive. And if you want to go through the full details of this case study, it is published in the EAGE's first break, January edition of this year. So if we look at just the shot records, the shot on the left looks terrible, super weak, lots of noise. You know, we've scaled them to the exact same scale so you can compare. But if we look at the acquired data, it performs very well. In fact, there's excellent continuity on the horizons, and it actually looks slightly better than this conventional explosive data. But you'll notice something, and this is an important part of seismic acquisition tests. We were uncertain exactly what the signal strength would be on the very first test, so we oversampled the small source. That means we had a small source every 2.5 meters on the line, and with the conventional explosive, there was only a source drilled every 15 meters. So we had 6 times the data. So although it looks excellent here, this isn't really a fair comparison. And this is an important consideration when you are designing your own seismic acquisition tests. You want to do an apples to apples comparison. So what we did is we decimated it to 15 meters. But we didn't just take the 2.5 meter data set after it was processed and decimated it. We went right back to the raw shots and did it from the beginning to mimic as if we had acquired the data that way in the field. The exciting thing is that we are seeing very comparable data. You can see that it's a bit noisier, but the interpreters were very happy with this result. Now, this is for a shallow target, and it was only drilled into 1 meter versus the conventional explosive drilled into 6 meters. The article goes into a lot more detail on all the different aspects of the test. And since then, we do see that similar to Vibrasize, when we're drilling shallow, there is an impact of hole depth on signal strength. The data set was then taken through a quantitative analysis and an inversion with a well tie here with a very good match and very comparable data on the clear wave decimated to the full to the same sampling as the conventional explosive. So you can see the benefits of going to a narrower line, but what if you have a deep target and the miniature equipment just doesn't have the signal strength for looking at something 2, 3, 4 kilometers depth? Maybe we're looking at a deep CCS or geothermal reservoir. Well, another way we can reduce the impact is to get rid of half the lines. So here we've dropped all the receiver lines, and we've put the receivers and sources on the same parallel lines. In this example here, we had 60-meter line intervals, so we've kept that the same. And what we see in this slice here of data is that we have data shown in red, and then we have a blank, and then we have data and a blank. So our lines for this target depth are quite far apart, and if we want to have continuous data and not end up with a lot of striping and having to over-interpolate the data, we're going to need to put those lines a bit closer together. That still provides almost a 20% reduction in linear footprint. However, because they are parallel lines and we're having to interpolate across data gaps, we still do see that striping in the data set. If we went to the narrower line width, we're starting to get close to that 50% aerial footprint reduction. But we wanted an improvement in data quality, so we started looking at different patterns of parallel lines. And to test this out, we had a real data set where the receivers and the sources and the lines were all at 20 meters, so basically a perfect grid. From that data set, we decimated it to a standard orthogonal for the area. And again, this is for imaging shallow seismic. So this is what would normally be acquired. We looked at those narrow parallel lines, and then we started adding some amplitude to the lines, and we looked at different line intervals. Now, there are different distributions of shots and receivers along these lines. This parallel line geometry has higher trace density than the orthogonal. The hexagonal and sinusoid both have much lower trace density, and the zigzag has matching trace density. So it's not just the line pattern, but also the distribution of the stations along the lines that is important. To do these comparisons properly from a processing perspective, we wanted to take them through a full AVO-compliant pre-stack time migration. But the question is, where do we decimate? At the raw shots or prior to migration? It's much cheaper to decimate prior to migration. So every data set we've worked with, we've put it through just a quick pass. Does it pass or fail that test? But the best data sets have then been decimated at raw shots, because that is going to give you a real comparison to how the data would be acquired in the field. So what that looks like is here's the fully acquired data set, fully sampled, and this is the orthogonal. So you can see we're looking at a time slice and an inline through the data. And you can notice that the data gets a little noisier. There's a bit of a drop in amplitude just when we go to the regular orthogonal geometry. So this is the right answer, and this is what we normally get. Now, this is with the pseudo decimation processing. If we do a decimation from raw shots, now you're seeing some significant differences here. Before, you were just seeing a slight change in amplitude and maybe a little more noise. But now, just looking back and forth between the pseudo decimation and the raw shot decimation, there's been a significant drop in amplitudes in this middle reservoir section, and we're seeing a little bit of shift in the statics. So this is a warning. If you do acquire data, acquisition data, and you want to do some comparisons, it's very important to do the comparisons based on how the data would actually be acquired in the field and not take shortcuts in processing. And to compare that full decimation back to the fully sampled data set, here's what we're seeing between the orthogonal and the fully sampled data set. The next steps after taking everything through processing was to look at it from an interpretation perspective. So now we're looking at well tie correlations. We're looking at different horizons, time and amplitude picks. We're slicing through the volume and looking at flattened slices. We're looking at the frequency, the phase, and then the NRMS calculation. So for those of you familiar with 4D or time-lapse seismic that's used for monitoring, say, steam injection or CO2 injection, what an NRMS calculation is usually done for is to compare the baseline survey to the monitor survey. In this case, the baseline and monitor are the same year because it's just one data set, and the difference is due to the geometry. So the NRMS is a very good way to calculate differences in geometry. So let's look at a couple of those comparisons. So this is looking at a grid to the orthogonal to the parallel line megabin, which has a slightly higher trace density, and depending on what width of line, an 8 to 42% reduction in total cutting. Here are the time slices, and you can see that it's very comparable. If we look at the amplitude slice, we do see that the data set is a bit smoother, but in general, quite comparable to the fully sampled data set. And the reason we go back to the fully sampled data set is if we just compared everything to orthogonal, we would be trying to find a geometry that matches orthogonal. We want to find a new geometry, so we need to go back to the fully sampled data set. When we look at the NRMS comparison, we can see that where we have structural changes, there's a bit more difference. Grays are a very close match. Getting into the greens and reds is less of a match. But interestingly, there's more gray in the megabin outside of those structural areas, showing that it might actually have a bit closer match in places to the grid, but it struggles a bit with some of the edges of the structure. And it struggles where we have a gap in the side due to a well pad. You can see that there's more differences in the interpolation across the well pad. Now, we wanted to look for more cost-effective and lower footprint geometries. Sorry. And what we see here are a couple patterns where we've added a little bit of amplitude to the line and a lot. This line is still close together at 40 meters. This one's out to 80 meters. We've pushed it really far apart. These two do have the same trace density. They have different distributions of shots and receivers on the lines. And we're auto-picking these data sets, so you can see some auto-pick errors because we have gone to the lower trace density. It doesn't look bad from the time slice, but if we look at the amplitude slice, we start to see some patterning in the data set. Different patterning than the striping that we see for the megabin on the hexagonal, and a little smoother due to the fewer shots and receivers on the data. But the sinusoid, you can see here that we're getting quite strong acquisition footprint on our amplitude slice. And this is related to the lines perhaps being a bit too far apart for the target depth. And it's a bit clearer to see if we look at the NRMS comparison. You can see that striping here. You see a little bit of yellows and reds showing up. But you see something else that's kind of interesting. That gap that the straight line megabin had trouble interpolating across is not as much of a problem for these other two data sets. So this gave us some ideas, and we realized there's a limit to how far you can push the data from a trace density perspective. So we came up with a geometry that exactly matched the trace density, and depending on the width of the line, has a 26 to 53% reduction in aerial footprint and about a 52% reduction in linear kilometers. So again, this one, pretty good match on the time slice. A little bit of auto pick error along the edge there. And on the amplitude, again, it's showing all the features that we see on the full data set. Like the megabin parallel line, not quite as crisp around the edges, and that's to be expected when we're interpolating data. And different interpolators will perform in different ways. So this is where we need to take the data set through multiple interpolators to see what all the differences could possibly be. Now, what's really fascinating is that the zigzag is performing a bit better in the cross-line interpolation than the orthogonal on this gap. And we're in the process of taking these data sets through some other tests where we put exclusions in and look at that interpolation across gaps. So the conclusions from phase one were that we can get a data set that's a pretty good match. It has a 50% land footprint reduction, and the gathers are also matching pretty well. So the next step was to take this on to inversion. So in phase two, we had multiple goals. First of all, take all the data sets from phase one through inversion. But secondly, if the inversion results look good, to go and actually acquire a data set in the field with a direct comparison. So the plan was to acquire a conventional 4D and an EcoSeis 4D. The problem with doing acquisition tests like this is that they're very expensive and cost double what a regular survey might cost, because we need to acquire the regular survey as well as the experiment. We also conducted 20-year we also conducted environmental studies, and it was a 20-year regrowth study. We did not go back in time. We instead went and found a location where the lines had been cut 20 years previously, and we looked at how they regrow depending on the habitat type. This will be probably published next year, so I'm not going to go into detail on that one. A really fun part of the testing from a geophysical perspective was we tested a bunch of different types of equipment, and the dispersion of how that equipment was deployed in the field. So if any of you attended the image conference and came to our booth, you might have seen some results from the geophone testing, where we compared 8 different geophones and sensors to each other. And we also looked at multiple different types of miniaturized sources and different arrays. All the equipment in the field was tracked so that we could calculate the GHG emissions associated with the different methods of acquisition. And all the seismic data that was acquired was processed, interpreted, and is currently going through interpretation and inversion. So I don't have results from this test to show you yet, but we will have results to show hopefully early next year. Another fun part of the test was we had 10 geometries that we looked at on the first phase of the project, but we kept having new ideas, and we are now up to 24 different geometries with another 10 slated to be tested. So if any of you have a geometry idea and would like to compare it back to some conventional geometries, we would love to talk with you, and we're open to running that through some testing for comparison. Everything has been run through, like I said, the pseudo decimation processing to get a quick look, and then the best geometries have been taken through full processing from raw shots, and the best as well through inversion. So I'm going to show you some results from a publication that came out in January. This is similar to the results we just looked at, but instead of having another parallel geometry, we have another sparse orthogonal. And the reason for that is people will say, well, why don't we just take the regular orthogonal geometry, push the lines a little further apart, and there you go. It's cheaper, there's less of a land footprint. That has about a 20% reduction in linear kilometers versus a 50% reduction when we're going to a zigzag geometry. And you can immediately see why how far apart you put your lines relates to how well you image your target. On the one where the lines have been pushed a bit further apart, you can see a very strong acquisition footprint on the time slice. And remember, on some of the other data, we weren't really seeing footprint on the time slice. Now, if we go and we look at some inversion results, here we're looking at acoustic impedance, that acquisition footprint is extremely strong. You can see if we compare everything back to the fully sampled data, even the orthogonal and the zigzag struggle to pick up all the geologic features that are seen in the fully sampled data set. But we saw some fascinating results. In places, the zigzag had a better match on the structure than the orthogonal, and then in other places, the orthogonal matched better. So there's pros and cons to both geometries. Going to the VPVS and density, we are seeing similar results here. There is a very strong acquisition footprint even on the orthogonal. Red colors are underestimating VPVS, blue is getting into an overestimation. Again, the orthogonal and the zigzag are not a perfect match, but we were happy to see the progress that the zigzag geometry here was making, as well as on the density. So I'm going to jump in now to a little bit on the field trial that we ran this past winter season. As I said, sorry, the slides are going to click all the way through. It was a comparison of a conventional 4D to EcoSeis. So this is what the geometry looked like. We had a standard orthogonal, and this was a repeat or monitor survey that was being acquired in the oil sands. And we came in and we utilized roughly 50% of the lines to acquire an EcoSeis geometry. As part of this test, we also looked at different types of sources and receivers. So the different colors represent different shot holes. One of the interesting things about this test is this is a permanent installation, the monitor survey. So the shot holes were all cased in and the geophones were buried. So we did have to drill in the shot holes for our program, and we had surface geophones. As a result, we had to go through some normalization of the fuel usage so that we could look at what a comparison would look like as if we were going into a new cut area. So this shows the full area where the data was acquired. And in one area, we were more highly sampled than the other. So we had like a 10-meter station here and a 20-meter station here. This is enabling us to do more decimation testing with the data sets. We also, our surface data had 3-component geophones. So we are taking our surface data through a 3C processing that's in the works right now. And The goal of the test was to compare a 3D to a 3D, but because there was a baseline and this was a monitor survey, we also had the opportunity to do a comparison of the new monitor's orthogonal to the baseline and the EcoSeis zigzag to the baseline. And that's currently going through inversion and is showing some absolutely fascinating results. I can't show you all the results yet here, but it's leading to some new ideas that maybe when we're doing our monitor surveys, we don't have to repeat every shot in the exact same location or receiver in the same location. And there may be ways that we can go to more cost-effective monitoring. And this would be particularly beneficial as we move into the CCS space. So the next steps for the project are to do some testing specifically for CCS. And this is going to be a multi-technology trial where we look at passive, active, and borehole seismic, because seismic is more than just the sampling or the geometry. We need to consider very carefully what energy source we have. Does it have sufficient strength to image our deep reflectors? And does it have a sufficiently light footprint on the surface to reduce our environmental impact? And then on the sensor side, particularly as we go to passive seismic, frequency content matters quite a bit. We have a lot of interest in the ultra low frequencies. And then with borehole seismic, we're going to look at VSPs and different types of VSPs, DAS, conventional, different interrogators. And then the plan is to take every technology through the full validation process. So we are interested in speaking to companies that would like to participate in the testing, whether they are a producer that is looking for different methods of cost-effective CO2 plume monitoring, or a technology provider that would like to get some full validation done on their data sets. So I went through all of that pretty fast, so we've got lots of time for questions. But before we get to the questions, I want to acknowledge all the companies that have participated in this project. We have our 5 oil company sponsors: Canadian Natural, Cenovus, ConocoPhillips, Imperial, and Suncor. They're part of the COSIA Pathways Alliance. We also have the companies that helped acquire the data in the field, from the drilling to the medic to the recording to the line clearing and the tracking. We have some technology companies that brought out their sensors, geophones, and sources. We have some environmental companies as well as universities that are participating in the research. Geophysical companies doing processing, inversion work, providing software, and of course, the rest of the funders, provincial funders, Alberta Innovates, and the Petroleum Technology Alliance Canada, and then federal funders, the Clean Resource Innovation Network, and NRCan's Industrial Research Assistance Program. So I'm happy to answer questions, happy to do a deep dive into any of the slides that you might want to discuss further. And yeah.
Hey, Andrea, thank you very much for a very comprehensive talk. We don't have any question in the chat yet, so if you have any question, please either put it in the chat or raise your hand and I can give you to speak straight away. So just go ahead and drop your question for Andrea. It has been very, very good. If not, I can start with mine. So you mentioned, Andrea, that all this technology has been applied so far in mainly shallower, very shallow objectives. Do you have plans for going deeper? Is there a limitation that you see to go deeper? Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
So the CCS test we're looking at would be a depth of 3 kilometers. From a geometry perspective, there is no problem in going deeper as long as we are designing, the source and receiver station interval and line interval appropriate for the target and what the data is going to be used with. But when it comes to the energy source and the sensors, that's where there would be limits on what is appropriate for the target depth. For example, in oil sands, we use very small vibra size. say 15,000 pounds, 26,000 pounds. But for a deep target, we'd want the larger vibes that are up around 60, 64,000 pounds. And similar with explosives. In oil sands, we might only drill 3 meters and set off an 1/8 kilogram of explosive. But for a deep target, we might want to drill 9 to 15 meters and use 1 to 2 kilograms of explosive. There are experiments that are going to be run where there are some new smaller sources and sensors that have the potential of performing well at depth, but that's part of bringing in the other technologies in the testing. I think for us, the key aspect of the test is to do the 4D monitoring and see how sparse of a 4D we can go with.
Okay, excellent. Okay, we have here one question from Wakas. He said, please elaborate the last slide more in detail. See, and the question is if to monitor CO2 plume, do we have to monitor it in real time?
Okay, so there's a lot of questions around monitoring. I would say the first most important thing, and this would be real-time monitoring that you'd actually want to run before you inject your CO2, and that's your passive seismic. So you want to understand in the area you're injecting, is there any natural seismicity? And then while you're injecting, you would want a few passive seismic sensors that are always running. These are very small, you wouldn't have very many, and they're checking to see if there's any induced seismicity from the injection. So that's your number one safety net. When it comes to doing a 3D survey and then the repeat survey, typically what would be done is you'd have a baseline that you do before you inject, and that you want fairly high resolution so you understand if there's any faults or fractures near where you're injecting. And then you would do a monitor survey periodically. And that monitor survey might be, when the plume is small, a monitor survey just with the VSP, with the vertical seismic profile. How often you need to do that monitoring, these are areas that people are still researching. There are some publications at some of the study sites up here in Canada. There's Shell's Quest, Carbon Management Canada's Newell County, and PTRC's Aquastore, where at Aquastore they've been monitoring for 25 years. But no, you don't need to be running your seismic continuously, but we would suggest that there is a passive seismic sensor out there running. Does that help answer the question?
Yes, thank you, it says. So very clear.
I see a question here about the number of geometries. So not all the geometries we're looking at are new. Some of the geometries are various methods of orthogonal geometry, like different line intervals, compressive sensing methods. There's a variety of different linear geometries with different trace densities. A particular favorite of mine, slant geometries, we've looked at. There's some, we've looked at symmetric versus irregular sampling of lines. We've looked at some grid type geometries and then perturbations of those. So I would say that, yes, there probably are more new ideas out there. We have some ideas on how we're going to combine the different geometries. And we're certainly open to discussion with universities, as I know that many of the universities are working on new algorithms for interpolation. So it'd be very interesting to test some of these geometries on the latest and greatest algorithms coming out of research for interpolating and recreating the data.
Okay, great. I see a hand raised by Erica. Let's see if this works. I'm giving you permission to talk. Erica?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Andrea, for the presentation. Very nice presentation. I was going to follow up on that question about the CCS example. Would you care to comment on pros and cons of having the permanent installation as opposed to repeat surveys?
Yeah, that's an interesting one because we have that's a very common method of monitoring oil sands steam injection, and some companies have chosen to go with the permanent installation, and some, rather than having a permanent installation, they're doing the repeat. Now, when it comes to CCS, one of the concerns that has been brought forward is some of these areas that we're looking at CCS reservoirs, they're in populated areas where there are farms. So the farmers are going out every spring and they're plowing the land and they're harvesting it in fall. So in those cases, you probably don't want a bunch of pipes sticking up out of the ground for permanent sources. So there's going to be some practical considerations. Now, from a technical perspective, having those cased holes that you're reloading and having the buried geophones, you're going to get the exact same location every time. In the past, I would say that mattered tremendously, but as processing algorithms have advanced, it doesn't appear to matter quite so much whether or not you're within millimeters of where your original station was. You still do want to get close, but if your energy source is more of a temporary energy source like VibraSeis, you always are going to have some errors and differences when you come back to repeat it. It's similar to marine surveys where you're trying to get the source boat positioned exactly the same. There's always going to be a little bit of flexibility. So if you have the ability to put in those sensors, there's definitely a cost savings. But the other consideration, and we have seen this in oil sands, is technology advances. So if you bury or a bunch of geophones or plant a bunch of nodes somewhere and they're there permanently for 10 years, the technology may have advanced over 10 years. And some of these CCS projects, we're looking at life cycles of 40 years. So how much is the technology going to change over 40 years? And do you want to be using the same sensor buried in the ground for 40 years? Or is there a limited lifetime to that permanent installation? So those are just some of my thoughts on that. I hope that gives you some ideas, but I'm happy to discuss that further offline.
Thanks, Andrea. Thanks, Erika, for the question as well. So any further question from the team here, connection? Well, I have another hand. Let me give you permission to talk. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Andrea, to respond on CCS especially. I have another question. Do we have to, what kind of source we are using here for monitoring? I mean, VibraSeis, it's not practical to stay there for a whole time. Is it, or we can use hammering here because the depth is not too much in this case. Normally, CCS is in shallow rocks. So I think hammering may work.
So in Canada, most of the CCS reservoirs we're looking at are at depths of 2 kilometers, although there is a shallow test site at only 300 meters that we're looking to test at. So it's not so much a question of a source appropriate for CCS, but more the cost and the signal strength. And this is where if you have an area and you're doing a study of, what does it look like for long-term monitoring, you'd want to look at previous seismic in the area, what those sources were, how well they worked. And if there's some new sources, you'd want to test them for sure before you go and move forward with your plans of using something. So I don't know. I don't know if that would work. Like it's going to depend on the geology, the target depth. It's usually part of all the calculations that go into figuring out your seismic acquisition, both 3D and 4D.
Okay, thank you, Andrea, for the clarification. Any further question from the group? I have another one myself. I was wondering, in your experience, which areas would you recommend at first starting for somebody that hasn't tested this type of techniques of savings, right?
So we are big believers in trying to incorporate testing into every seismic program that you're doing, whether that's just a simple 2D and you're going out there with fiber size. It's always good at the start of a project to run some tests to figure out the sweep. But if you have the opportunity and you know you're going to be doing seismic over multiple years within a certain area, then, and there's certain technologies you want to test, then in the first year, you could go in with more conventional methods and incorporate some of those other techniques into your regular survey so that you can analyze them. And then the next year when you come back, you may want to switch to a different method. It can be expensive to go out and run dedicated source tests, geophone tests. So for us on the EcoSeis project, when we wanted to test the geophones, one of the project participants was going to be going out and running some other tests, and they were happy to have that equipment come out on their job. So there's ways to more efficiently incorporate that into the field work, but you need to make sure you budget the time and money to do the proper processing and interpretation analyses. And I see a question,
Okay,
how realistic is
it
in underdeveloped countries? I need a bit of a clarification there. Are you referring to CCS or are you referring to kind of what we're doing with EcoSeis? And I can answer the EcoSeis one. This will work anywhere, and we're looking at possible deployment in South America, as it can be. It doesn't have to be the perfect pattern. We can modify the geometry as needed in sensitive habitats around different residential areas. I think where it's not so much the geometry being ported to other countries, it's what sort of equipment and energy sources are available in country to make it more affordable. And then the geometry can be optimized to be utilized with a specific type of equipment that you have in country. Now, in terms of CCS, I'm not an expert by any means on carbon management globally. So I do know that North America is pursuing CCS quite heavily. But what I would say is all of us with any of our operations, we should be looking for efficiencies. And that's what we've also tried to do with EcoSeis is if we're going to go out and acquire this seismic program, how can we do it with using the least fuel possible, the least emissions possible? How can we do this as efficiently as possible so that it's very cost effective to monitor over time? And I see there's a question, what determines an area to be suitable for carbon capture? Well, I was just participating in PTRC's TCP EOR conference and target depth. So where are you sequestering that CO2? Because it's going to change phase depending on temperature and depth, and it's more stable in certain areas. Do you have the pore space to inject it into? So what's the porosity of your rock? And very important is, do you have a good seal? So, is there sufficient cap rock? Is the reservoir you're injecting into large enough to hold the volume of CO2 you want to put into it without overpressurizing it? And is it in a seismically stable region? You probably do not want to go inject CO2 near an active earthquake fault. So that's very high level, as I'm not a geologist, but I hope that helped answer your question.
And here's another one asking, Priyanka asking, what about geological challenge country like Nepal?
We have seen just from water injection that it can reactivate faults and cause minor earthquakes. We have had those experiences here in Canada. So again, geological studies would need to be done to understand what's safe and what isn't. So I don't think I could answer that for Nepal. But personally, I think that we want to be very careful in a seismically active region. And that's one of the reasons that we recommend doing the passive seismic monitoring initially, like for 3 to 6 or maybe even 9 months before you'd start injecting, to make sure there is no seismic activity naturally occurring in the area.
Okay, thank you. Okay, any further question for Andrea in the audience? How can we monitor CO2 through VSP? Wakas ask.
Okay, that's so are you familiar with VSP? Because that's the vertical seismic profiling. And we have sensors. They could be individual geophones put down the borehole and clamped to the sides, or it could be a fiber optic cable. And then we have sources on the surface generating the energy. So it's very similar to seismic reflections from the surface, like a 3D seismic program, but we have the energy is just going straight down, reflecting off a target in the subsurface into the borehole. So it's quite accurate, but where its limitations are is how far out from that borehole it can see. So in the initial days, or not days, in the initial years when your plume is just growing, and here in Canada, we're looking out to 300 to 500 meters at about 2 kilometers depth. VSPs are working very well, and I would refer you to some of the papers by Shell on their Quest project, because they go into a lot of detail on VSP monitoring. But as the plume gets larger, you're going to hit a point where the plume is outside that cone of imaging for a VSP, and that's when you're going to need other seismic methods, ideally 4D seismic, but it could be a 2D repeat as well for monitoring. However, VSPs remain quite valuable in monitoring immediately around the borehole, because that is a potential leakage path. And there's been a lot of research done on that at Carbon Management Canada's Newell County. So I'd encourage you to look at papers there on kind of the near borehole monitoring of VSPs. I see another question. How practical are the different geometries to deploy? There are practicalities to it. Like, I'm not showing the full pattern of how we would go in and ensure the lines are interconnected in places. That's an important consideration. You don't want to go cut a bunch of parallel lines, whether they're straight or in the EcoSeis pattern, and not connect them, because you'd be walking a very long distance on your program. So there is operational considerations. I didn't include it in this presentation, but our ops people have put together a description of how easy this would be to deploy in the field. And one of the benefits of it is when you have lines going in perpendicular directions, if you're cutting with one mulcher going this way and mulchers going this way, you don't want them interfering with each other. You don't want operations interfering with each other. So on an orthogonal program, all your operations might need to be spread further apart. Whereas on some of these parallel programs, operations can be more streamlined. And we're facing some challenges here in Canada with getting people to work on seismic programs. So they can potentially be done with smaller crews as well, which is beneficial to the acquisition companies. So I don't have an efficiency number, but if you think about cost savings or fuel usage, I had that example of a 25% savings in fuel usage. So that is also an efficiency measure.
Okay, great. Can you elaborate a little bit on microseismic as well? Is that comparable to what you say on BSP?
Microseismic is a type of passive seismic. So you have sensors, but you don't have an energy source. And they are typically monitoring continuously and they're listening for very small microseismic events or microfracturing induced seismicity. So it's a different type of seismic. We refer to it as passive. You're not necessarily going to get an image of your reservoir, although there have been experiments run. It's more going to help you identify where there might be activity in the subsurface. It is used quite a bit when fracking to help them identify, is the frac occurring in the right location and propagating through the rock in the direction expected.
Thank you. Any further question from the audience? Well, I think we don't have any more. Well, I want to thank you on behalf of SEG Women's Network for your time and availability to give this talk. Has been very, very valuable from us. So thank you, Andrea, again from your time. Thank everybody that joined this meeting. And I invite you to see the next coming meetings that will follow shortly. So thank you so much for your availability.
Well, thank you very much, Teresa. And if anybody wants to reach out, my email is was shown there. I'm happy to have further discussions with you on any seismic acquisition related topics.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Andrea. Appreciate it.
Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.